The summer of 1844 hung heavy over Boone County, Kentucky. Thunderheads gathered on the horizon as Margaret Thornton walked the grounds of Rosemount Plantation, her pale blue dress catching the last rays of sunlight before the storm. At 32, Margaret was the sole inheritor of the Thornton estate after her husband Richard's sudden death 3 years prior. She had maintained the plantation's prosperity against all expectations, a feat that stirred both admiration and suspicion among neighboring landowners. "Miss Margaret," called Esther, the head house servant, from the veranda. "Mr. Collins is here to see you." Margaret tensed. Samuel Collins was the county magistrate, a man whose visits seldom brought good news. As she entered the parlor, the tall, bearded man stood with his hat in his hands, a grave expression etched across his weathered face. "Margaret," he began, dispensing with formalities, "there's been talk, disturbing talk about you and one of your property." The room felt suddenly airless. Margaret's fingers instinctively reached for the locket around her neck. Inside, a small portrait of Isaiah, the plantation's literate blacksmith whom Richard had purchased 7 years earlier. "I don't know what you mean, Samuel," she replied, her voice steadier than her heart. "A document has been discovered," Collins continued, "a marriage certificate between you and a slave named Isaiah, dated 6 months after Richard's passing." He watched her face carefully. "Is it true?" The question hung in the air like the coming storm. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall. "And if it were?" Margaret finally answered, lifting her chin. Collins's face darkened. "Then you've committed a crime against the natural order, against God's law and Kentucky's. The penalty is severe, Margaret." "I've committed no crime of the heart," she said, "and any other accusations will need to be proven in court." "Then court it shall be," Collins replied grimly. "You are to appear before Judge Winthrop next Tuesday to answer these charges. Until then, the authorities will be confiscating your slave Isaiah as evidence." Margaret felt her world tilt. "You cannot take him." "We already have," Collins said, placing his hat on his head. "He's been moved to the county jail for safekeeping until the trial." After Collins left, Margaret collapsed into a chair, her mind racing. The servants whispered in corners, fear rippling through Rosemount like wind through cornfields. Later that night, as rain lashed against the windows, Esther entered Margaret's bedroom with a cup of chamomile tea. "Miss Margaret," Esther whispered, "there's something you should know about Isaiah." Margaret looked up, her eyes red-rimmed. "He never made it to the county jail," Esther continued. "They're saying he escaped during transport. There's a search party forming at first light." A mixture of hope and terror washed over Margaret. If Isaiah had escaped, he might find freedom, but he would be hunted mercilessly. "And there's more," Esther added. "Mr. Collins took your ledgers, the ones in the study." Margaret's breath caught. The ledgers contained not only the plantation's financial records, but also encoded notations on the movement of escaped slaves through Rosemount, a secret Margaret had kept even from her husband during his lifetime. For 3 years, Rosemount had served as a station on the Underground Railroad, a dangerous secret that could now be exposed alongside the scandal of her forbidden marriage. As dawn broke, Margaret dressed in a simple dark gown. She would not flee, she would stand her ground. But first, she needed to secure help. She wrote a hasty letter to Jacob Pearson, a Quaker lawyer from Cincinnati, known for his abolitionist sympathies, begging him to come to her aid. While the letter was dispatched by a trusted servant, Margaret received an unexpected visitor. Josephine Winters, the widow of the neighboring plantation owner, arrived unannounced. "I had to come," Josephine said as she entered the parlor, her usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled. "The whole county is ablaze with talk of you and your blacksmith." Margaret offered her tea with a steady hand. "Have you come to condemn me too, Josephine?" "No, I've come to understand," the older woman replied, surprising Margaret, "and perhaps to help." Josephine had always been cordial but distant, part of the old Southern aristocracy that Margaret, originally from Philadelphia, had never fully penetrated. They say you married him, Josephine continued. Is it true? Margaret set down her teacup. If I answer you honestly, you could be compelled to testify against me. Or for you, Josephine countered. Margaret, I've watched you these past years. How you've run this place, how you've treated your people. It's not the way things are done here, but there's something to be admired in it. A silence fell between them, filled only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Richard knew, Margaret finally said. Before he died, he knew about Isaiah and me. Josephine's eyes widened. That changes things. Does it? In the eyes of the law? Perhaps not. But in the eyes of society? If Richard gave his blessing? Margaret laughed bitterly. He didn't give his blessing. He gave me an ultimatum. End things with Isaiah, or he would sell him south. That's why. She stopped herself. Why what? Josephine pressed. Nothing, Margaret replied too quickly. The suspicion that had begun to form in some corners of Boone County that Margaret had hastened her husband's demise was not something she could discuss, even with a potential ally. 3 days before the trial, Jacob Pearson arrived from Cincinnati. Tall and austere with Quaker plainness, he brought with him not only legal expertise, but news from the broader abolitionist movement. They're using your case to make an example, he explained as they sat in Margaret's study, the shelves now empty of the incriminating ledgers. The pro-slavery factions fear the growing abolitionist sentiment. A white woman of property, choosing to legally bind herself to a slave, strikes at the heart of their social order. I didn't marry Isaiah to make a political statement, Margaret protested. Perhaps not, Pearson replied. But that's what it has become. And there's more at stake than your reputation or even your freedom. If they search deep enough into your affairs, they'll find Rosemount's other activities, the Underground Railroad. If that were discovered, Margaret could face charges of theft, the stealing of human property, and inciting insurrection, potentially capital offenses. What of Isaiah? Margaret asked. Have you heard anything? Pearson's expression softened slightly. Only rumors. Some say he's making for Canada. Others believe he's still in the area, attempting to find a way to help you. He should run, Margaret whispered. As far as possible. Would you run? If you could, Pearson asked. Margaret glanced around the room at the home that had become both her prison and her purpose. No, she said finally. I would stand and fight for what I believe. As the day of the trial approached, Margaret received another visitor. This time, Franklin Thornton, Richard's cousin and the man who would inherit Rosemount should Margaret be convicted. Cousin, he greeted her with false warmth. What a terrible predicament you found yourself in. Franklin had always resented Richard's marriage to Margaret, viewing her as an outsider and interloper in family affairs. What do you want, Franklin? Margaret asked directly. To offer a solution, he replied smoothly. Sign Rosemount over to me now, and I'll ensure the charges are dropped. You can return to Philadelphia with a modest stipend, your reputation somewhat intact. And Isaiah? Franklin waved a dismissive hand. The slave will be dealt with if captured. That's no longer your concern. Get out, Margaret said quietly. You're being foolish, Franklin warned. Do you know what happens to white women who lie with slaves? The court won't just take your property, they'll destroy you. I said get out. After Franklin departed, Margaret sat alone in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow she would face Judge Winthrop, a man known for his harsh sentences and pro-slavery views. The evidence against her, the marriage certificate, possibly testimony from household servants, was damning. Yet running now would only confirm her guilt and endanger the entire network of the Underground Railroad that depended on Rosemount's strategic location. That night, as she prepared for bed, Margaret heard a soft tapping at her window. Her heart leaped to her throat as she pulled back the curtain to find Isaiah's face looking back at her. You shouldn't be here, she whispered urgently, opening the window. They're searching everywhere for you. Isaiah climbed through his strong blacksmith's frame, moving with surprising grace. At 34, he carried himself with a dignity that defied his legal status as property. "I couldn't leave you to face them alone," he said, taking her hands in his. "Not after all we've done together." The moonlight caught the scar that ran along his jawline, a reminder of the brutality he had endured before coming to Rosemount. "How did you escape?" Margaret asked. "Friends," Isaiah replied simply. "The same friends who've helped others through Rosemount, but I didn't come to tell you that. I came to show you this." From his jacket, he withdrew a small leather-bound book, Richard's personal journal. "Where did you get this?" Margaret asked, taking it with trembling hands. "He kept it in the forge," Isaiah explained. "Said it was the one place you'd never look. I found it the day after he died, but never showed you. Now you need it." Margaret opened the journal, flipping through pages of her late husband's handwriting until she reached entries from the weeks before his death. What she read made her blood run cold. Richard had discovered their secret, not just her relationship with Isaiah, but Rosemount's role in the Underground Railroad. He had been gathering evidence, planning to expose them both, to have Isaiah sold, and Margaret committed to an asylum for moral insanity. The final entry, dated the day of Richard's fatal riding accident, detailed his plan to meet with Magistrate Collins the following morning. "This changes everything," Margaret whispered. "If they find this—" "They won't," Isaiah assured her. "But it might explain why Collins is so determined to see you ruined. Maybe Richard confided in him before." The unspoken implication hung between them. Richard's death had been ruled an accident. His horse had apparently been spooked by a snake, throwing him and breaking his neck. But rumors had circulated, especially after Margaret's unconventional management of Rosemount began. "You need to go," Margaret urged. "If they catch you here—" "I'm not leaving Kentucky without you," Isaiah insisted. "Not this time." Their eyes met, years of shared secrets and forbidden love passing between them. "The trial starts tomorrow," Margaret said. "Jacob Pearson believes they'll use me to set an example." "Then we'll give them an example to remember," Isaiah replied, a determined gleam in his eyes. "Do you trust me?" "With my life," Margaret answered without hesitation. As dawn approached, Isaiah slipped away, leaving Margaret alone with Richard's journal and a dangerous new knowledge. Tomorrow she would face not only the law, but the court of public opinion. Her reputation, her freedom, and her very life hung in the balance. But for the first time since Collins had appeared with his accusations, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. The storm had passed, but a greater tempest was gathering on the horizon. The Boone County Courthouse stood as a monument to authority, its red brick exterior and white columns projecting the power of law and order in the still young state of Kentucky. By 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, the building was surrounded by a crowd of spectators, plantation owners, tradespeople, free blacks standing at a cautious distance, and even a handful of northern journalists drawn by the scandalous nature of the case. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations that fell silent as Margaret entered, flanked by Jacob Pearson. She wore a modest black dress, her hair pulled back severely, her face pale but composed. As she took her seat at the defendant's table, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her. Judge Elias Winthrop entered, a severe man in his 60s whose family had owned land in Kentucky since before statehood. The bailiff called for all to rise, and the proceedings began with a formality that belied the sensational nature of the charges. "Margaret Thornton," Winthrop intoned, looking down at her over wire-rimmed spectacles, "you stand accused of violating the laws of Kentucky by entering into an unlawful marriage with a Negro slave, thereby undermining the natural order established by God and preserved by our statutes. How do you plead?" Before Pearson could answer, Margaret rose. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The prosecutor, William Hardin, approached the bench. A political aspirant with ambitions beyond Boone County, Hardin saw the Thornton case as a stepping stone to greater recognition. "Your Honor," he began with practiced gravity, "the Commonwealth will prove that the defendant, Margaret Thornton, did willfully and knowingly enter into a marriage ceremony with a slave named Isaiah. thereby committing a crime against nature and the established order of our society. Hardin's opening statement painted Margaret as a dangerous radical, infected by abolitionist thinking during her northern upbringing. He described how, after her husband's convenient death, she had begun implementing unnatural ideas at Rosemount, reducing labor hours, permitting slaves to learn reading, and most shockingly, developing an inappropriate relationship with the blacksmith Isaiah. But she went beyond even these transgressions, Hardin declared. She formalized her perversion through a mockery of the sacred institution of marriage. He held up a document. We have here a certificate, signed by an itinerant preacher named Thomas Wilkins, recording the marriage of Margaret Thornton to a man identified only as Isaiah, dated October 17, 1841, 6 months after the death of Richard Thornton. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Judge Winthrop gavelled for silence. When Pearson rose for the defense's opening, his approach was measured. He acknowledged that Margaret had indeed developed feelings for Isaiah, but questioned the authenticity of the marriage certificate. We intend to show that this document is a fabrication, created by those who wish to seize Rosemount Plantation from my client, specifically Franklin Thornton, cousin to the late Richard Thornton, and next in line to inherit should Mrs. Thornton be found guilty. The prosecution's first witness was Samuel Collins, the magistrate who had first confronted Margaret with the allegations. Mr. Collins, Hardin began, please tell the court how this marriage certificate came into your possession. Collins shifted in the witness chair. It was brought to me by Reverend Wilkins himself, who claimed to have performed the ceremony in secret. He was troubled by his conscience and felt duty-bound to report what he had done. And where is Reverend Wilkins now? Pearson asked when his turn for cross-examination came. Collins cleared his throat. He has returned to his circuit in Tennessee. Convenient, Pearson remarked. So we have only your word that this man exists and that he personally delivered this document to you. You question my honor, sir? Collins bristled. I question the absence of a key witness, Pearson replied evenly. And I would like to know why you waited nearly 3 years after this alleged marriage to bring charges, if the certificate was delivered to you shortly after the ceremony. Collins flushed. I hope to spare the community the scandal. I spoke privately with Mrs. Thornton first, encouraging her to end the abomination quietly. Did you? Pearson pressed. Mrs. Thornton recalls no such conversation prior to your visit last week. The testimony continued with Franklin Thornton taking the stand. With practiced solemnity, he expressed his shock and disappointment at his cousin's widow's behavior. Richard would be turning in his grave, Franklin declared. He was a man who understood the natural order of things. He would never have permitted such relations on his property. Yet, Pearson countered during cross-examination, your cousin left Rosemount entirely to his wife, with no restrictions on how she might manage it. If he had concerns about her judgment, why would he do so? Franklin's answer came too quickly. He never imagined she would betray his memory in such a fashion. As the morning wore on, the prosecution called household servants from Rosemount, clearly hoping for damning testimony about Margaret's relationship with Isaiah. But here, Hardin met with unexpected resistance. Esther, when questioned about Margaret and Isaiah's interactions, replied with careful neutrality. Miss Margaret treats all the people at Rosemount with respect, sir. But did you observe any particular closeness between her and the blacksmith? Hardin pressed. Isaiah keeps the forge, sir. Miss Margaret, she runs the plantation. Their paths cross when work requires it. Other servants provided similarly opaque testimonies, frustrating Hardin visibly. During a recess, Margaret whispered to Pearson, They're protecting themselves as much as me. If they admit to knowing about Isaiah and me, they could be punished for not reporting it. The afternoon brought the prosecution's most dramatic witness, a white overseer named Silas Jenkins, who had been dismissed from Rosemount shortly after Richard's death. She was always going to the forge, Jenkins testified with barely concealed contempt, lingering there after dark, and the way the slave looked at her, it wasn't natural. "Did you ever witness any physical contact between Mrs. Thornton and Isaiah?" Harden asked. Jenkins hesitated, then nodded. "Once I saw them embracing in the shadows behind the forge. When I confronted her about it the next day, she dismissed me from service." During cross-examination, Pearson established that Jenkins had been dismissed for excessive cruelty to the slaves, not for any supposed discovery about Margaret and Isaiah. He also revealed that Jenkins had since found employment with Franklin Thornton, suggesting a motive for false testimony. As the first day of the trial concluded, Margaret felt both drained and strangely emboldened. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown, with positions hardening on both sides. Some called for her immediate imprisonment. Others, particularly younger women and known abolitionist sympathizers, watched her with veiled admiration. Back at Rosemount, under the supervision of a court-appointed administrator, Margaret met with Pearson to discuss strategy. "They have the marriage certificate," Margaret acknowledged, "and while their witnesses haven't been entirely convincing, the document itself is damning." "Yes," Pearson agreed. "We need to discredit it directly, or what?" "Oh, we need to change the narrative entirely." Pearson's eyes glinted with a strategist's calculation. "Margaret, there's something you haven't told me, something about Richard's death." Margaret stiffened. "It was an accident. His horse—" "I know the official account," Pearson interrupted gently. "But Franklin's eagerness to see you convicted, Collins's delayed action on the certificate, the suspicious timing of all this, there's more here than a simple case of miscegenation." Before Margaret could respond, Esther entered with a folded note that had been delivered by a young boy who immediately ran off. Margaret read it, her face paling. "What is it?" Pearson asked. "It's from Isaiah," Margaret whispered. "He's going to turn himself in." "That would be madness," Pearson exclaimed. "He'll be imprisoned, possibly executed." "He says he has evidence that will exonerate me." Margaret handed the note to Pearson. "Something about Richard's business dealings with Collins." As night fell, Margaret couldn't sleep. The thought of Isaiah surrendering himself, placing his life in the hands of a system designed to subjugate him, was unbearable. Yet she also recognized the tactical advantage his testimony might provide if he lived long enough to deliver it. Shortly before midnight, a commotion outside drew Margaret to the window. Torchlight illuminated the drive as a group of riders approached Rosemount. Leading them was Sheriff Thomas Burke, with a bound figure on horseback beside him. Margaret rushed downstairs, ignoring Pearson's caution to remain inside. As she reached the veranda, the riders came to a halt, and she saw that the bound man was Isaiah. "Mrs. Thornton," Sheriff Burke called out, "we've apprehended your runaway. Found him trying to break into the magistrate's office in town." Isaiah's face showed evidence of rough handling, a split lip, a bruise darkening on his cheekbone. But his eyes, when they met Margaret's, held no regret. "What will happen to him?" Margaret asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "He'll be held in the county jail until your trial concludes," Burke replied. "Then, depending on the verdict, he'll either be returned to Rosemount's new owner or sold at auction to recover court costs." As the riders turned to leave, Isaiah managed to call out, "The ledger, Margaret! Collins' ledger from 41. A deputy silenced him with a harsh blow, and then the group was moving away, leaving Margaret standing in the torchlight, Pearson and the household staff watching anxiously from the doorway. "What did he mean?" Pearson asked when they were alone in the study. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "Collins keeps records of all official transactions in the county, but I don't see how that helps us." Unless," Pearson mused, "there's something in those records that connects to your case, something Isaiah discovered while working as a blacksmith in town." The second day of the trial began with a surprising development. The defense called Josephine Winters to the stand, a move that caused whispers throughout the courtroom. The widow was respected in Boone County society, her testimony carrying significant weight. "Mrs. Winters," Pearson began. "How long have you known the defendant?" "Since she arrived as Richard's bride, nearly 10 years ago," Josephine replied, her voice clear. "And in that time, did you ever observe anything inappropriate in her conduct?" Josephine's gaze swept the courtroom before settling on Margaret. "Margaret Thornton has always conducted herself with dignity. After Richard's death, she managed Rosemount with more skill than many men could claim. Did you ever observe any particular relationship between Mrs. Thornton and the slave Isaiah?" A hushed anticipation fell over the room. "I observed that Isaiah was treated as all Rosemount slaves were treated, with a Christian kindness that some might consider excessive, but which I found admirable." Josephine paused. "And I observed that Richard Thornton had particular concerns about Isaiah." Hardin objected immediately. "The deceased is not on trial here, Your Honor. I'm merely establishing the context of relationships at Rosemount," Pearson argued. Judge Winthrop allowed the questioning to continue with caution. "Mrs. Winters, what concerns did Richard Thornton express about Isaiah?" "Richard believed Isaiah was educated beyond what was proper for his station. He once told me at a dinner party that he suspected Isaiah could read and write, and that he might be passing messages for abolitionists." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Winthrop gavelled for order. "And did Richard ever express concerns about his wife's management of Rosemount?" Pearson continued. "Objection!" Hardin rose to his feet. "This line of questioning is irrelevant to the charges. On the contrary," Pearson countered, "it speaks directly to motive, not Mrs. Thornton's but others who might wish to see her removed from Rosemount." After a tense moment, Winthrop overruled the objection. "You may answer, Mrs. Winters." Josephine straightened. "Richard confided in me approximately 1 month before his death that he had discovered something disturbing about Rosemount's operations. He believed Margaret was allowing the plantation to be used as a way station for runaways." Gasps filled the courtroom. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as her secret work with the Underground Railroad was laid bare. "Did Richard mention any intention to act on these suspicions?" Pearson asked. "He said he was gathering evidence, that he had documentation that would expose not only Margaret, but others involved in the abolitionist network." "And did he mention who he might share this evidence with?" Josephine hesitated. "He mentioned Magistrate Collins specifically." During cross-examination, Hardin attempted to redirect the focus to the marriage certificate, but the damage was done. The spectre of Richard Thornton's suspicions about Rosemount's involvement with the Underground Railroad now hung over the proceedings, complicating the straightforward narrative of Margaret's alleged crime. As the day progressed, Pearson called a surprise witness, Thomas Burke, the very sheriff who had brought Isaiah in the previous night. "Sheriff Burke," Pearson began, "could you tell the court about your discovery when you apprehended Isaiah?" Burke shifted uncomfortably. "He had broken into Magistrate Collins's office. When we caught him, he was examining a ledger from 1841. "And did you ascertain what he was looking for?" "He kept asking about October transactions, something about a payment from Richard Thornton to Collins." Hardin objected strenuously, but Pearson argued that if such a payment existed, it might establish a conspiracy between Richard Thornton and Collins that would be relevant to the current charges. Judge Winthrop, his interest clearly piqued, overruled the objection. "I'll allow this line of questioning. In fact, I'll order Magistrate Collins to produce the ledger in question for the court's examination." When Collins took the stand again, his previous confidence had evaporated. The ledger now entered into evidence showed a substantial payment from Richard Thornton to Collins on October 16, 1841, 1 day before the date on the supposed marriage certificate. "Can you explain the purpose of this payment, Mr. Collins?" Pearson asked. "It was a personal loan," Collins replied stiffly. "Richard and I had business dealings outside my official capacity." "A loan of $500, a considerable sum. Was there a promissory note?" "Not formally, no. We were gentlemen." "And has this loan been repaid to Richard's estate?" Collins's silence was damning. As the second day of testimony concluded, the shape of the case had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a trial about Margaret's alleged marriage to a slave had evolved into a complex web of insinuations about Richard's death, Rosemount's connection to the Underground Railroad, and potential corruption involving Magistrate Collins. That evening, Pearson was cautiously optimistic. "We've muddied the waters considerably," he told Margaret, "but we still need to address the marriage certificate directly." "I want to testify," Margaret declared. "I need to speak for myself." "It's risky," Pearson warned. "Hardin will attack you mercilessly, and anything you say about your relationship with Isaiah could still condemn you, regardless of the certificate's authenticity." Margaret squared her shoulders. "I've lived with secrets too long. It's time for truth, as much of it as can be safely told." As they strategized deep into the night, a storm gathered once again over Boone County. Lightning illuminated Rosemount's grounds in harsh flashes, thunder rolling across the Kentucky hills like distant cannons, harbingers of the courtroom battle to come. In the county jail, Isaiah sat in darkness, the taste of blood still in his mouth, waiting for dawn and what might be his final act of defiance against a system that had claimed his body but never his spirit. The truth he carried could save Margaret, or condemn them both. Dawn broke with a clarity that belied the storm of the previous night. The courthouse steps were already crowded as Margaret arrived for what promised to be the most dramatic day of testimony. News of the case had spread throughout the region, drawing even larger crowds, including a delegation of abolitionists from Cincinnati who stood in silent support as Margaret passed. Inside, Judge Winthrop called the court to order with a stern warning about maintaining decorum regardless of the day's revelations. Margaret, seated beside Pearson, noticed that Franklin Thornton appeared unusually agitated, conferring urgently with Hardin before proceedings began. The prosecution called its final witness, a surprise to the defense. Dr. James Wilson, the physician who had attended Richard Thornton after his riding accident, took the stand. "Dr. Wilson," Hardin began, "you were the first to reach Richard Thornton after his fall, is that correct?" "Yes," the doctor confirmed. "I was returning from another patient when a slave from Rosemount found me on the road, saying his master had been thrown from his horse." "And in your professional opinion, were Richard Thornton's injuries consistent with such an accident?" Dr. Wilson hesitated. "The broken neck, yes. But there were other marks that gave me pause." "What kind of marks, doctor?" "Bruising on his wrists and forearms, as if he had been restrained at some point before the fall." A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Margaret felt herself grow cold. "Did you include these observations in your official report?" Hardin asked. "No," Wilson admitted. "I mentioned them to Magistrate Collins privately, but he suggested that they were likely from Richard's efforts to control his horse before being thrown." During cross-examination, Pearson established that Wilson had changed his story over time, initially signing a death certificate citing only the accident, then gradually introducing suspicions after private meetings with Collins and Franklin Thornton. "Dr. Wilson," Pearson pressed, "isn't it true that you owe significant gambling debts to Franklin Thornton?" The doctor's face flushed. "That's a private matter." "Is it? Or does it explain your convenient recollection of details that support Mr. Thornton's narrative? A narrative that would remove Mrs. Thornton from Rosemount and place the plantation in his hands." Before Wilson could answer, the doors to the courtroom swung open and a commotion drew all eyes. Sheriff Burke entered, leading Isaiah in chains. Despite his bonds and the visible evidence of rough treatment, Isaiah walked with his head high, his gaze fixed on Margaret. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Judge Winthrop demanded. "Your Honor," Burke explained, "the prisoner insisted on appearing before the court. He claims to have testimony relevant to these proceedings." Hardin objected immediately. "This is highly irregular, Your Honor. A slave cannot testify in proceedings involving white citizens." "I'm not here to testify," Isaiah spoke, his voice clear and educated, shocking many who had never heard him speak. "I'm here to confess." Judge Winthrop, clearly intrigued, overruled Hardin's objections. "Let the record show that the slave Isaiah has been brought before this court at his own request, not as a witness, but to make a statement." Isaiah was led to the front, but not permitted to take the witness stand, a privilege reserved for free citizens. Instead, he stood before the bench, chains rattling slightly as he shifted his weight. "Isaiah," Judge Winthrop addressed him directly, "you claim to have a confession. Proceed." Isaiah drew himself up, scanning the courtroom before his gaze settled on Collins. "I confess that I forged the marriage certificate presented to this court." Gasps and exclamations filled the room. Margaret stared at Isaiah, confusion and fear warring in her expression. "I learned to read and write while still in Virginia before coming to Rosemount," Isaiah continued once the commotion subsided. "Master Richard discovered my literacy, but kept it secret, using me to write correspondence he wished to keep private." "Including correspondence with Magistrate Collins," Isaiah added, looking directly at the increasingly uncomfortable official. "I knew their hand. I knew their paper. After Master Richard's death, I created the marriage certificate, dating it October 17th, 1841, a day chosen with purpose." "What purpose?" Judge Winthrop asked, now leaning forward with undisguised interest. "To match the day after Richard Thornton paid Samuel Collins $500 to help dispose of runaway slaves captured on Rosemount property. Not to return them to their owners, but to sell them downriver and split the profits." The courtroom erupted. Judge Winthrop pounded his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the court if order wasn't restored. "This is outrageous!" Collins shouted over the din. "The slave is lying to protect his mistress. The ledger confirms the payment," Isaiah countered once silence returned. "And I can prove the certificate is a forgery because the Reverend Wilkins, whose signature appears on it, has been dead since 1840. A fact known to few outside of Tennessee, but discoverable in county death records." Sheriff Burke stepped forward. "Your Honor, we confirmed this last night. Thomas Wilkins, a circuit preacher, died of typhoid in Memphis in May of 1840. The revelation sent another wave of murmurs through the courtroom. Judge Winthrop called for a brief recess to restore order and consider this dramatic new evidence. As the court emptied, Pearson whispered urgently to Margaret, "Did you know he would do this?" "No," Margaret replied, watching as Isaiah was led away. "He's sacrificing himself." "He's clever," Pearson observed. "By claiming he forged the certificate alone, he's shielding you from the original charge without implicating you in the forgery." When proceedings resumed, Judge Winthrop announced that he would allow Isaiah's statement to be entered into the record, though not as formal testimony. The defense then called Margaret to the stand. As she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, she felt a strange calm descend. The moment for secrets had passed. "Mrs. Thornton," Pearson began, "did you enter into a marriage with your slave Isaiah as alleged by the prosecution?" "I did not," Margaret answered firmly. "No ceremony took place, legal or otherwise." "Were you aware of the certificate's existence before Magistrate Collins confronted you with it?" "No, I was as shocked as anyone to learn of it." "But," Pearson continued carefully, "is it true that you developed feelings for Isaiah beyond those appropriate between mistress and slave?" Margaret met his gaze steadily. "I came to value Isaiah's intelligence, his character, and his humanity. In a different world, perhaps." She left the sentence unfinished. "Let's discuss your late husband," Pearson redirected. "Was Richard aware of your regard for Isaiah?" "Yes," Margaret acknowledged. "Shortly before his death, he confronted me. He threatened to sell Isaiah to a plantation in Mississippi, known for its cruelty." "Did you have any involvement in your husband's death?" Pearson asked directly. "No," Margaret replied without hesitation. "Richard rode out alone that morning, as was his custom. I was in the house with Esther and 2 other servants when we received word of his accident. When Hardin's turn for cross-examination came, he approached with the confidence of a predator sensing weakness. Mrs. Thornton, if the marriage certificate is indeed a forgery, as Isaiah claims, why would he create such a document? Margaret considered carefully. I believe he thought it would protect me. Protect you? Hardin pressed. From what? From the advances of men like Franklin Thornton, who made it clear after Richard's death that he expected to claim both Rosemount and me through marriage. Franklin Thornton half rose from his seat, face flushing with anger, but Hardin motioned for him to remain seated. Are you suggesting, Hardin continued, that a slave took it upon himself to create a document that would put both of you at risk of prosecution simply to deter unwanted suitors? Isaiah's actions have always been those of a man, not a slave, Margaret replied, causing another stir in the courtroom. And what of the allegations regarding Rosemount's involvement with the Underground Railroad? Hardin demanded. Do you deny using your plantation to harbor fugitive slaves? Pearson objected strenuously. Your Honor, Mrs. Thornton is not on trial for any such activities. This is clearly an attempt to prejudice the court. Sustained, Winthrop ruled. Mr. Hardin, confine your questions to the matter at hand, the alleged marriage and the authentication of the certificate. Hardin's questioning grew increasingly aggressive as he sought to undermine Margaret's testimony, but she remained composed, neither confirming nor denying the relationship with Isaiah beyond what she had already admitted. When Margaret stepped down, Pearson requested the opportunity to call one final witness, Samuel Collins himself, to be recalled for further questioning about the newly discovered discrepancies in the marriage certificate. Collins, however, was nowhere to be found. Sheriff Burke reported that the magistrate had left the courthouse during the recess and had not returned. Judge Winthrop frowned deeply. Sheriff, issue a warrant for Collins's immediate return. We will adjourn until tomorrow morning. As the court dispersed, word spread quickly through Boone County. Collins had fled, taking with him whatever secrets lay in the connection between the mysterious payment from Richard Thornton and the forged marriage certificate. That evening, Franklin Thornton arrived unexpectedly at Rosemount, brushing past the court-appointed administrator to confront Margaret in the parlor. You've orchestrated this well, he seethed, declining the offer of a seat, turning attention away from your own crimes to fabricate some conspiracy between Richard and Collins. I've orchestrated nothing, Margaret replied coldly. If there's been a conspiracy, it appears to have been between you and Collins, using a forged document to seize what Richard left to me. Franklin paced the room, agitation evident in every movement. You don't understand what's at stake. Rosemount isn't just a plantation. It's a symbol of the Thornton legacy in Kentucky. A legacy built on the backs of enslaved people, Margaret said quietly. Franklin stopped, fixing her with a hard stare. You really believe all that Northern abolitionist nonsense, don't you? That these people are our equals, that someone like Isaiah is worth 10 of you? Margaret finished for him. Yes, I do believe that. Then you're a fool, Franklin spat, and after tomorrow, you'll be a disgraced fool with nothing. Because even if that marriage certificate is proven false, the rumors about your unnatural relations with a slave will follow you forever. After Franklin stormed out, Pearson arrived with news. Collins has been apprehended trying to cross into Ohio. He'll be in court tomorrow, willing or not. And Isaiah, still in custody but treated well on the judge's orders. Margaret, I believe we've turned the tide, but there's still danger. If Collins implicates you in the Underground Railroad activities, then I'll face those charges if necessary, Margaret replied resolutely. But first, we finish this battle. As night settled over Rosemount, Margaret stood on the veranda, watching lightning flicker on the distant horizon. Another storm was approaching, both literally and figuratively. Tomorrow would bring either vindication or ruin, freedom or imprisonment, not just for her, but for Isaiah, and potentially for the entire network of the Underground Railroad that depended on Rosemount's strategic position. Inside her locket, unseen, was not only Isaiah's portrait but a tiny key, the key to a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of her bedroom, where the true ledgers of Rosemount's involvement in helping slaves escape to freedom were kept. If Collins broke under questioning, if those ledgers were discovered, everything would change. Margaret touched the locket gently. "For freedom," she whispered to the night, a prayer and a promise intertwined. The final day of the trial dawned with an electric tension that seemed to vibrate through Boone County. The courthouse was filled beyond capacity, with spectators crowding the aisles and spilling onto the street outside. Among them were faces both hostile and supportive, the community having fractured along lines that reflected the deeper national divisions over slavery and freedom. Margaret entered with her head held high, though the sleepless night showed in the shadows beneath her eyes. Pearson walked beside her, his Quaker plainness a stark contrast to the elaborate dress of the Southern gentry filling the gallery. At the prosecution table, Hardin conferred with Franklin Thornton, both men casting occasional glances toward the door. When Judge Winthrop took the bench, he surveyed the crowded room with evident displeasure. "I remind everyone present that this is a court of law, not a public spectacle. Disruptions will not be tolerated." Sheriff Burke entered, leading a haggard-looking Samuel Collins. The magistrate had clearly not fared well since his attempted flight. His clothes were disheveled, his face unshaven, his eyes darting nervously around the courtroom. "Mr. Collins," Judge Winthrop addressed him sternly, "you left these proceedings without permission, necessitating your forcible return. Be advised that I am considering contempt charges in addition to any other matters that may arise from today's testimony." Collins was sworn in again and took the stand where Pearson approached with deliberate calm. "Mr. Collins," he began, "the court has heard testimony that the marriage certificate you produced, allegedly signed by a Reverend Thomas Wilkins, could not be authentic because Reverend Wilkins died in 1840, a year before the certificate's date. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Collins's hands trembled slightly as he gripped the rail of the witness box. I was given the certificate in good faith. If it's a forgery, I was deceived as well." "By whom?" Collins hesitated, his gaze flicking to Franklin Thornton. "I cannot say with certainty." "Let me help refresh your memory," Pearson suggested. "The court has established that you received a payment of $500 from Richard Thornton on October 16, 1841, the day before the date on the supposed marriage certificate. What was that payment for?" "As I testified earlier, it was a personal loan." "A loan that was never repaid to Richard's estate," Pearson noted. "Mr. Collins, did you and Richard Thornton have business dealings involving slaves?" Collins's face paled. "I don't know what you mean." "I believe you do," Pearson pressed. "In fact, I believe that payment was connected to an arrangement whereby you would help Richard dispose of runaway slaves captured on Rosemount property, not by returning them to their rightful owners, but by selling them downriver for profit." "Objection!" Hardin shouted. "This is outrageous speculation." "Your Honor," Pearson countered, "this goes directly to motive. If Collins and Richard Thornton were engaged in illegal slave trading, and if Mrs. Thornton discovered this after her husband's death, it would provide a compelling reason for Collins to want her removed from Rosemount before she could expose their operation." After a tense moment, Judge Winthrop overruled the objection. "Answer the question, Mr. Collins." Collins looked trapped. I cannot recall the specific purpose of that transaction." "Perhaps this will help your recollection," Pearson suggested, producing a weathered journal. "The court has already admitted Richard Thornton's personal journal into evidence. I would like to direct your attention to the entry dated October 15, 1841. As Pearson handed the journal to Collins, the magistrate's hands shook visibly. The courtroom fell silent as he read. "Would you please read that entry aloud for the court?" Pearson requested. Collins cleared his throat. Arranged final details with Collins. $500 for his assistance with the Memphis shipment. 3 captured runaways to be transported without documentation. Estimated profit, $2,000 to be split between us. Must ensure Margaret remains unaware, as her northern sensibilities would object strenuously. A collective gasp rose from the spectators. Judge Winthrop gavelled for silence. "Mr. Collins," Pearson continued relentlessly, "did you and Richard Thornton engage in illegal slave trading?" Collins seemed to deflate before the court's eyes. Richard had business acumen. He recognized an opportunity when slaves were captured passing through his property. Rather than return them for small rewards, he suggested we could increase our profit. "And after Richard's death, did you fear that Mrs. Thornton would discover this arrangement?" "She was already changing how Rosemount operated," Collins admitted, "reducing work hours, improving conditions. There was talk that runaways were finding safe passage through the plantation rather than being captured. I became concerned. Concerned enough to conspire with Franklin Thornton to remove Mrs. Thornton from Rosemount using a forged marriage certificate?" Pearson asked directly. Collins's gaze dropped. "Franklin approached me 3 months ago. He said he had evidence of Margaret's inappropriate relationship with Isaiah. He suggested that if she were convicted of such a crime, control of Rosemount would pass to him, and our previous arrangements could continue." The courtroom erupted again. Franklin Thornton leapt to his feet, shouting denials, while Hardin frantically tried to call for order. Judge Winthrop pounded his gavel repeatedly. "Silence!" Winthrop thundered. "Mr. Hardin, control your client or I will have him removed." When order was restored, Collins continued, his voice barely audible. "The certificate was Franklin's idea. He had access to Richard's papers, including records of the preacher who had married Richard and Margaret years earlier. We didn't know the man had died." Did you or Franklin have any involvement in Richard Thornton's death?" Pearson asked, his voice cutting through the hushed courtroom. Collins looked up, genuine shock on his face. "No. Richard's death was unexpected, a complication to our business, not an objective." Hardin's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. The prosecutor, sensing the collapse of his case, attempted to salvage what he could by focusing on the impropriety of Margaret's feelings for Isaiah, regardless of whether a marriage had occurred. "The law still forbids such relations," Hardin insisted. "Even absent a formal ceremony, Mrs. Thornton's own admission of inappropriate regard for her slave represents a violation of natural law." Judge Winthrop, however, appeared unmoved by this line of argument. When both sides had concluded their questioning, he called for closing statements. Hardin's closing was subdued, an attempt to redirect the court's attention to the social order that Margaret's actions had allegedly threatened. "Whatever conspiracy may have existed between Collins and Franklin Thornton," he argued, "it does not excuse the defendant's unnatural sentiments toward her slave." Pearson, in contrast, delivered a powerful summation that framed the case in terms of justice and truth. "Your Honor, what we have witnessed in this courtroom is not the exposure of a crime by Mrs. Thornton, but rather a criminal conspiracy against her. A conspiracy motivated by greed, by fear of exposure, and by a desperate attempt to maintain a system that enriches some by degrading others. Margaret Thornton came to Kentucky as a bride, bringing with her values that some might find challenging to the established order. After her husband's death, she chose to manage Rosemount according to her conscience, improving conditions, treating the enslaved people under her care with dignity. For this, she was targeted by those who saw her as a threat. The prosecution has failed entirely to prove the existence of an illegal marriage. Indeed, the evidence conclusively demonstrates that the marriage certificate was a forgery, created as part of a scheme to seize Rosemount from its rightful owner. Justice demands not only that Mrs. Thornton be acquitted, but that those responsible for this conspiracy face the full consequence of their actions. When Pearson finished, a hush fell over the courtroom. Judge Winthrop announced that he would retire to consider his verdict, returning after what felt to Margaret like an eternity. "In the matter of the Commonwealth versus Margaret Thornton," Winthrop began, his voice solemn, "this court has heard testimony regarding an alleged illegal marriage between the defendant and her slave. We have also heard evidence of a conspiracy to falsely implicate Mrs. Thornton using a forged document. The prosecution has failed to provide credible evidence of an actual marriage ceremony. The certificate presented has been conclusively proven to be fraudulent. Therefore, on the charge of entering into an illegal marriage with a slave, I find the defendant not guilty." A mixture of cheers and angry murmurs filled the courtroom. Winthrop gavelled for silence. "However," he continued, "testimony in this case has raised serious questions about other matters. I am ordering an immediate investigation into the allegations of illegal slave trading involving Samuel Collins and the late Richard Thornton. Mr. Collins will remain in custody pending further proceedings. Additionally, I am referring the matter of Franklin Thornton's alleged conspiracy to create and use false evidence to the grand jury for consideration of criminal charges." Franklin Thornton rose, his face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage. The woman has bewitched the court with her northern ideas. She still admits to harboring unnatural feelings for a slave." "Mr. Thornton," Winthrop warned, "control yourself or face contempt charges." "And what of her involvement with the Underground Railroad?" Franklin persisted. "Will that be investigated as well?" A tense silence fell. Margaret held her breath as Judge Winthrop considered the accusation. "This court has heard no credible evidence regarding such activities," Winthrop stated carefully. "In the absence of such evidence, no investigation is warranted." His eyes met Margaret's briefly, and she understood. The judge was deliberately closing the door on that line of inquiry. "This court is adjourned," Winthrop declared, bringing down his gavel with finality. As the courtroom began to empty, Sheriff Burke approached Margaret and Pearson. "Judge Winthrop has ordered Isaiah's return to Rosemount," he informed them. "He'll be brought there this evening." "Thank you, Sheriff," Margaret replied, relief evident in her voice. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had grown even larger, with tensions visibly high between those celebrating Margaret's acquittal and those outraged by the verdict. Pearson escorted Margaret through the throng, accepting congratulations from supporters and ignoring jeers from detractors. "It's not over," Pearson cautioned as they reached the carriage. "Franklin won't give up easily, and there are those who will never forgive what they see as a challenge to their way of life." "I know," Margaret acknowledged, "but for today, truth has prevailed. That's enough to begin with." Back at Rosemount, as dusk settled over the Kentucky landscape, Margaret stood on the veranda waiting for Isaiah's return. The household staff moved with a new lightness. The cloud of uncertainty that had hung over the plantation finally lifted. Esther joined her, offering a cup of tea. "What happens now, Miss Margaret?" Margaret considered the question. "Now we continue the work we've begun, making Rosemount a place where dignity is possible for all who live here." "And Isaiah?" Margaret's hand went to her locket. "Isaiah and I both understand that some things must wait for a different world than the one we live in now, but we can work toward that world, even if we may not live to see it." As night fell, a single rider approached, Sheriff Burke, leading a horse carrying Isaiah. When they reached the house, Burke released Isaiah from his shackles. "By order of the court," Burke announced formally, "Isaiah is returned to Rosemount Plantation and the custody of Mrs. Margaret Thornton." After the sheriff departed, Isaiah and Margaret stood facing each other in the soft lamplight spilling from the house. The household staff had discreetly withdrawn, leaving them a rare moment of privacy. "You risked everything," Margaret said softly. "As did you," Isaiah replied, "the moment you chose to see me as a man, not property. What you said in court about forging the certificate to protect me from Franklin, a necessary lie," Isaiah acknowledged. The truth would have condemned us both. They stood in silence, aware of the fragile nature of their victory. The forces aligned against them, the law, society, tradition, remained powerful and unforgiving. Yet in this moment, they had carved out a small space for truth and dignity. "Tomorrow," Margaret said finally, "we need to discuss the future of Rosemount. The changes we'll continue to make, the people will continue to help." Isaiah nodded, understanding her meaning. The Underground Railroad would continue its work, with Rosemount serving as a crucial link in the chain to freedom. "For now," she continued, "you should rest. You've earned it." As Isaiah turned toward the quarters, Margaret called after him, "Isaiah." He looked back. "Thank you," she said simply, "for reminding me what courage truly looks like." Later that night, alone in her bedroom, Margaret opened the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Inside were the true ledgers of Rosemount, records of every person who had passed through on their journey to freedom, every dollar spent to bribe officials or purchase supplies, every contact in the network stretching north to Canada. She added a new entry. August 14th, 1844, justice prevailed in Boone County. The work continues. As summer faded into autumn, Rosemount underwent subtle transformations. Margaret implemented changes that improved conditions while avoiding undue attention from neighbors still suspicious of her northern ways. Isaiah, his position now that of trusted foreman rather than just blacksmith, helped oversee these changes with a quiet authority that the other enslaved people respected and responded to. Franklin Thornton was indicted by the grand jury, but fled Kentucky before he could be arrested, reportedly heading for Texas. Samuel Collins faced charges of corruption and illegal slave trading, his reputation and position destroyed by the revelations of the trial. And on moonless nights, travelers still found their way to Rosemount, staying briefly in a hidden room beneath the barn before continuing their journey northward. If anyone in Boone County suspected these activities, they chose not to investigate too closely, the memory of Margaret Thornton's triumph in court serving as a deterrent to those who might otherwise have interfered. The story of the trial spread throughout Kentucky and beyond, embellished and transformed with each telling. In some versions, Margaret was portrayed as a dangerous, radical, undermining Southern society. In others, she became a heroic figure, challenging injustice at great personal risk. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, in the daily choices of a woman who simply refused to accept that human dignity could be bought and sold. As for Margaret and Isaiah, they continued their work side by side, their private feelings subordinated to the greater cause they served. Their victory had not changed the world, but it had preserved their small corner of it as a place where freedom remained possible, not just as a distant destination for those passing through, but as an ideal worth fighting for, day by day, in a land still struggling to define the true meaning of liberty and justice for all. Years later, when the greater conflict that had been brewing finally erupted into civil war, Rosemount would serve as a haven for those caught in the crossfire of a nation tearing itself apart over the very questions that Margaret and Isaiah had confronted in their own lives. And though neither lived to see the formal end of slavery in America, their story, whispered among those who found shelter at Rosemount, continued to inspire courage in dark times, a reminder that freedom begins in the human heart long before it is enshrined in law. The Lady of Rosemount who stood trial for marrying her slave became a legend, but the truth of Margaret Thornton and Isaiah was something more profound, a testament to the power of seeing the humanity in others when the world is determined to deny it, and to the enduring hope that justice, though long delayed, cannot be forever denied.